Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Matthews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from the complexity of development to the art of resistance, from colonial histories that haunt us to reimagining futures. In this episode, we look at fire from the viewpoint of archaeometallurgy. And for this, I was thrilled to have such an interesting discussion with Professor Sharda Srinivasan. She is professor at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore. She was elected International Honorary Member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2021 in Archaeology. She received the Padmashri, India's fourth highest civilian award, in 2019, and has made pioneering contributions to the study of archaeology and history of art from the perspective of exploring engineering applications. To start with, I would like to say a few things about the field of archaeometallurgy, based on Professor Srinivasan's own writings on this. She looks at what the study of metals, of archaeological artifacts, leads to. First, it helps to understand the history of technology and the progression of metals in civilization. Second, is that for the conservation of artifacts, one needs to understand their corrosion behavior, composition, etc. Third, it helps us to get a better insight into archaeology and art history. Professor Srinivasan's own work has included exploring the actual scientific analysis of the elemental composition and what that can tell us about the metallurgical characterization of objects. When she has been asked in the past as to what drew her to archaeometallurgy in India, she states that it draws together in three dimensions the connections between the geometric, the anthropomorphic, and elements of devotional poetry, dance, and Bhakti-era philosophy. In this conversation, we looked at the fire element in several ways. First, we explored the trajectory of the development of humankind, which is linked intrinsically to the increasing ability to master fire. The progressive use of metals or metallurgy was pivotal to human evolution, and even now we find that no device or pursuit lacks an element of combustion technology. From the hearth to kilns and fiery furnaces, unknown forms and embellishments were forged for the good and for the bad. We spoke about some of these contradictions and some of the gender divides that followed this fiery progression, something I hope to explore further in future work. Professor Srinivasan brought up some very interesting illustrations of ancient lost wax casting in India and the making of carnelian beads, and the role of women in ceramics, such as Kota women from the Nilgiris. We covered fire symbolism and cultural references in Vedic literature, Tamil Sangam poetry, and in the Nataraja bronzes, which has led to philosophical musings on the cosmic dance depicted, to Fritjof Capra calling it the dance of subatomic particles. In her own work, she has made landmark contributions in archaeometric characterizations of these bronzes in South India, using lead isotope analysis. Professor Srinivasan is also an accomplished exponent of the dance form of Bharatanatyam, and so we also spoke about some of the fire symbolism in dance and in her more contemporary performances. It was a really educational episode for me, so I hope you enjoy it too. Professor Srinivasan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you at the Subverse.
Thank you so much, Susan. I'm very delighted to be on this very interesting podcast series. And thank you for thinking of me. And also, thank you very much for thinking of this very interesting theme of fire and asking me to reflect on something which is quite close to the subject area that I've worked on. Thank you for drawing my attention to it in a more purposeful way.
Let me start off with the following thoughts and questions. In A.J. Wilson's The Living Rock, he quotes Aeschylus, who writes in Prometheus Vinctus, "From bright fire they will learn many arts." It's quite clear that the trajectory of the development of humankind is so fundamentally and intrinsically connected to the increasing ability to master fire and learn many arts. And we are going to speak specifically about the field that you have been immersed in, which is metallurgy. Can you tell us more about how this primal discovery of fire and the subsequent discovery of metallurgy was such a momentous step in terms of our own human evolution?
I think that the science of the mastery of fire, which is known as pyrotechnology, has been a really fundamental, the great reason why mankind has reached the strides that she has had is because of this ability to create and manipulate fire, going back to the early use of flintstones, and then maybe using the hearths for cooking and such like. And then, the whole development of material sciences owes itself to progressive mastery of the use of fire at increasing temperatures and so on. And of course, the early material scientists would have been then using clays and so on and firing them to make terracottas. And you have some very early examples, which is from Neolithic Europe. And it's also interesting there, of course, the connection between maybe the cooking hearths and then moving on to clays and terracottas, because, so many of these early Neolithic terracottas are representations of women, what we have been tempted to describe as mother goddesses, for instance, going back to Serbia and so on, Neolithic Europe in 20,000 BC or so. And even in the Indian subcontinent, some of the very early terracottas of the pre-Harappan period in Mehergarh and so on, again, are representations of women. And these very interestingly enigmatic female figurines, which, of course, also raises the question as to who the early creators of these terracottas were. And it's quite interesting that you do have some instances of women also being potters and so on. For example, the Kota tribes in the Nilgiris, it's the women who essentially make the pottery and so on. And it's also interesting there that there is certain taboos where the women were the potters and the men were the metal workers and so on, because of the fact that I've spoken, for instance, to Kota potters and I've spoken to the Kamari blacksmiths. And so the Kotas, of course, say it's not because it's not a woman's job, but it's because the heat is so much that, naturally that affects women more, because could have had instances even in early antiquity of women also playing a role in pottery and so on. But, well, coming back to the whole point about material science, so the extraction of different types of materials also depended on ability to go into higher temperatures, such like. And the early metals that would have been used, of course, were, the noble or the native metals, which they would have found. And in that sense, copper is actually found in the native state. So native copper was used quite early, around 6,000 BCE or so. But then, of course, the copper ores are also colored. You have the azurite ores, the malachite ores, the copper oxide ores, and then those were being used. But the reason why you have the copper and the Bronze Age, for instance, coming before the Iron Age is because iron is not found that easily in the elementary state on the earth. I mean, you get elemental iron really in the form of meteoritic iron, but not on the earth because it is combined with the ores. And it's much more difficult to separate elemental iron from the ores. I mean, the temperatures needed for iron smelting is much higher. And that's why, again, coming back to the role of fire, that's why the Iron Age comes later, and the ability to extract iron. It's also interesting that the ways in which these materials would have been discovered also would have been linked to some extent the accidental discovery in the smelting hearths. For instance, in Egypt, you see that they were using fines a lot, which is a kind of clay with a lot of quartz. And then when you fire it, it gets a kind of glaze. So you see fines being used. And in the Harappan context as well, you have fines beads and so on. And it's thought that sometimes they would have been using some of these, greenish copper ores like malachite or azurite also for making fines. And that's how accidentally they'd have reached the temperatures for copper smelting, and then the copper would have been extracted. And likewise, it's also been postulated that in the Near East, it's when they were undertaking copper smelting using, for instance, iron ores and such like as a flux, so they'd have also been part of the copper iron sulfide ores. So they would have suddenly reached the higher temperatures needed to reduce iron, and so iron would have been accidentally produced. So, we owe a lot to these accidental ways of playing around with hearts and so on for many of these discoveries in antiquity. And it's also interesting that the case of the old world, The Incas never actually did any iron smelting. Of course, they used a lot of very fascinating alloys, gold, silver alloys, and tumbaga, but they didn't actually invent bellows, and so they couldn't reach those high temperatures that they needed to smelt iron and so on. So they never went into the Iron Age.
I'm curious here, and thank you so much for bringing up the bellows. So, I wanted to ask a little bit about the role of charcoal, because I've heard that was so important in terms of reaching those kind of intense volcanic like intensity. And of course, the role of the bellows. If you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, even if you look at Egyptian art and you see some of these paintings, depicting the bellows, some of the evidence which we as archaeometallurgists look for, to see if there is evidence of smelting and so on, what you typically find are these terracotta pipes, which are called tuyères, which would have been at the bottom of the furnace, and that would have been, and inside that, these buffalo hide bellows would have been sort of packed so that you could sort of blow the draft into the furnace to raise the temperatures. And, it's also quite interesting, since we are talking about the Mysore and the Malabar region, you do have some of the sketches of Francis Buchanan, who was traveling around Mysore, and in this area, of course, going back to much earlier times, but certainly around this time, when Buchanan was there around 1800 or so. This was just after the fall of Tipu Sultan. He did observe some of these traditional furnaces which were used for making a kind of high-grade steel, which the south of India was known very well for, known as ukku or urukku. And this, because ukku and urukku also goes back to this Tamil word which means to boil. And basically here it was a process of crucible refining where this wrought iron was being packed with a lot of carbonaceous materials like wood and so on, and being fired to very high cycles, reducing cycles, so that the carbon could go into the wrought iron to give steel. Because wrought iron generally has very little carbon, about less than about 0.04% carbon. And so this carburization process was to get a particular composition of steel, which we call high carbon steel, of about 1.2% carbon, because then these ingots had very special properties of superplasticity and so on, and they could be used to forge these beautiful Damascus blades. So the point I'm also making here is that those accounts also tell you very specifically how they were trying to collect particular types of woods for the charcoal and the kinds of leaves which are being packed inside the crucibles for carburizing. So, there's a whole range of understanding of the kinds of organic materials and so on that were needed to fire these furnaces. And it was interesting, because the other day also I was watching this video of how the fire was being made for one of these traditional Vedic rituals or homams, where it's like using a traditional drill actually. You have a block of wood with cylindrical holes in them, and then you have a wooden pole put into it, and there's a rope, and then somebody keeps pulling the rope back and forth and so on. So it's this friction method of generating fire, which is quite old, and it is was still used in this case mainly for the ritual purposes and the homams and the fire rituals. So there would have been a lot of this kind of observing of the kinds of woods and charcoals needed to achieve these kind of high temperatures, and in preparing charcoal as well. So these are all facets which have obviously died out now, but it is interesting to recreate for our overall understandings. It's not just about the field of metallurgy, because if you look at the Harappan evidence, you also have very fascinating techniques of using pyrotechnology in the making of beads. For instance, the carnelian beads, where this chalcedony is, of course, heated, but they also have this tradition of making these etched carnelian beads, where there's a particular kind of white paste, very fine decorations drawn by using this alkaline paste, which is mixed with, again, some plant materials. And then they would heat those beads, and then you get this beautiful red color and the contrast with the white etching and so on. So, yeah, it's quite astonishing how all of these aspects would have been so closely observed over time and used in these functional products, but also used a lot for symbolic purposes. That's the interesting aspect, the combination in the pre-modern world of always of the symbolic and the aesthetic with the functional. There was not really a kind of separation, if you know what I mean.
We'll be back after a break. Thank you. I find this really fascinating. And in fact, it's made me think about something, because one of my previous guests, Stephen Pine, He's a fire historian, has written almost 40 books on the subject of fire. And one thing he talks about, and he says that there's almost no device or pursuit that has lacked an element of combustion technology. And you talked about kind of this early past, but if you look at even present day electronics and computing, I mean, in the past you had gold, silver, copper, iron, but now you have the importance of lithium and cobalt and rare earth materials. And you also talked about design and decoration. And I wonder, in terms of your work, I mean, how do you see this evolution, maybe from the kiln and pottery to using kind of fire in a kind of a creative and artisanal manner, to how this has become something which is so commercial and so capital driven?
Underscoring the idea of fire, because fire was also the great source of energy in those days. You have now other ways of producing that energy, the coal-fired plants, and moving on to other kinds of reactions, which again generate energy, electricity, such as nuclear energy and the fission chain reaction of the uranium thorium cycle and so on. And I suppose that transformation from fire, which was a very rudimentary source of heat, to generation of electricity, which now has become central, is an existential crisis here, the need for energy and electricity. And so, of course, there's no comparison in that sense, just exponential, after the Industrial Revolution, not just the range of materials which have been come into vogue and so on, but also the range of needs for energy and electricity and so on. And yes, so in that sense, there is, of course, it is now the bone of the whole capitalist, economy and such like. And there's also, of course, the other side, that technology is a beast which always has these two sides that you're always worried about. And that's where you're reminded of the symbolic descriptions of a fire. For instance, in the Nataraja bronze, you have the Shiva Nataraja is holding the drum of the creation in one hand and the fire of destruction of Samhara on the other side. And I think technology also has both of these dimensions, that on the one hand side, it is creative, it is enhancing, and on the other side, there is always this latent fear of its destructive power. The same with nuclear energy as well, which is now, in a way, it's coming back into vogue also because people are worried about clean energy and the fact that the fossil fuels and so on will sort of accelerate climate change and so on. And so I think it's now looked upon perhaps with less skepticism maybe in the past. Of course, you do have renewables, but the fact is that if you want to generate large amounts of energy, then those kind of options are still very much on the table, nuclear and such like. And then, of course, lately, I guess when it comes to fire, we have these very graphic images, which we're always hearing about the forest fires and so much of pollution and such like. And some of them, again, are accidental, and some of them are also because of the desertification, I suppose, climate change. I think there's a lot more attention needed actually to study fire, as it were, in its larger implications.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you mentioned the bronzes and the dance of Shiva, because you've written about this. And I'd like you to maybe speak a little bit more about this. I mean, the symbolism. And of course, Fritjof Capra used the dance of Shiva in his book, The Tower of Physics. And you've also written about that. So I'd love to hear more from you about that.
Well, yeah, it's, of course, one of those it has a lot of these contemporary resonances, partly maybe because of the artists who were observing the Nataraja bronze, such as Rodin, and as you say, and of course, people like Carl Sagan, who felt it had this metaphor of, at that time with modern physics, we were, as he said, coming to the appreciation of these very astronomical phenomenon of, the birth of supernovae and the death of stars and so on. It was at that point, I guess, that this imagery was seen to convey something perhaps more than other pre-modern works of art or whatever. This notion, maybe with such a graphic description, you have Shiva dancing with, as I said, diametrically opposing hands, one holding this drum, which is associated maybe with Srishti and sound, and the other is the fire or Samhara. And also there is this very graphic circle, this aureole of, the flames around the Shiva Nataraja image. And of course, this idea of the Panchabhuta, the five elements, and that is also evoked in some of the poetry of Manika Vachikar, where he, for instance, says, when will I get to see the unique one who is earth, wind, water, and fire, and all of these five elements? So in a way, aspiring the whole ethos of bhakti poetry, whereas aspiring for it through this personal connection with the divine in a more abstract way or transcendental way, which was then sort of bypassing some of the more ritualistic ways of worship and so on at the time when these chola bronzes were being cast. And likewise, you have, I think one of my favorites is also there's a very beautiful seated Kali image from Samian Viruddhi, which I had also analyzed because some of my work is also as an archaeometallurgist and found that some of the Chola bronzes have about 10% tin and, or rather 7% tin and 7% lead. So they're basically leaded bronzes. And there was one very beautiful Kali image where her hair is also shown as a kind of halo, but standing up like a flame. So you do have, of course, the flame depicted in a very graphic way. And again, Kali, because it's this feminine energy, which is also destructive and creative and a rather powerful image there. But the flame has other kinds of symbolisms. You also see it as the Ushnisha, which you see some of the Buddhist bronzes, both in Nagaparthanam and also maybe more prominently in Sri Lanka, which is like the flame of enlightenment on the head and so on. So, the fire has always had these kinds of symbolisms across cultures. Of course, in Zoroastrian worship, also a symbol of purity and the eternal fire, and as you also see in the worship of Agni, which is also in a way cognate to the Latin word ignite, going back to the Indo-European root. But there's also a very lovely metaphor in Tamil Sangam poetry, which quite literally kind of conjures the idea of the sticks which would have been used to make fire. There's a beautiful verse, of course, the Tamil Sangam poetry goes back to about the late first millennium BC to early century CE. And so in this grand poetess Avaya, a lot of her verses are addressed to the chieftain Anchi, and she compares his nature to, the fire sticks, which when they are just kept aside and they're kind of latent, when he's going around mingling with common people and so on and being very helpful and giving. And so that is his latent nature. But one shouldn't, kind of underestimate, because when provoked, then they'll get ignited and he's ready for war like these fire sticks. So it's quite lovely how they were observing all of these aspects, of course, in various forms. And you also have Agni, of course, who's depicted in art as well, because he's one of the dog guardians, Dikpalas, who's depicted in sculpture in the southeast direction, and he's depicted riding a ram and so on. It's also been one of those special symbols in such lights.
Thank you so much. And I think it links beautifully with what I want to ask you next, which is about your own dance experience and practice. Because I know that you're an extremely accomplished dancer and you have a range of experience in this regard. So I'm also curious to see how you see fire and its symbolisms in dance.
As I said, for me, in a way, of course, dance, I trained in the Bharatanatyam tradition, and the most important imagery there, where, we enact fire in a way is, for instance, in Mohamana Varnam, there is a part where we show how Shiva as an ascetic is deep in meditation. And of course, Parvati is trying to woo him over, and she's also ascetic and so on. And it is Cupid as Kamadeva who then comes, directs the arrow to awaken Shiva and rouse in him passion and so on. So then he opens his third eye and incinerates Kama down to ashes. So that's the part that we depict quite a lot. Then, of course, after that, it's when he notices Parvati, and then that episode is also there in Kalidasa's Kumara Sundaram. Then he accepts Parvati as his wife. So I was also quite inspired by that. And I actually acted in a film called The Nuclear Winter. That was when I was at the Indian Institute of Technology, because I always had this background of one foot in the scientific camp and the other in the artistic camp when I was studying engineering physics. And this film was time of the Cold War, and it was called Nuclear Winter. So it was about all these students who were responding to these ideas and trying to maybe also show in an artistic fashion the concerns about what would happen if you had nuclear conflagration. And it's still very topical. And so I sort of did this bit, which is basically from the Mohamana Varnam of fire incinerating. And in other ways, for instance, there's another very lovely verse of Andal, which is, again, maybe not directly about fire, but what fire can do, because she actually describes a facet of the lost wax process, because these bronzes, as I was talking about them, they were made first by making a wax model and carving the wax in the shape of the icon to be made, and then invested with numerous layers of clay, and then the mold would have been heated and the wax melted out and then the metal poured in. And Andal uses it in a metaphoric way where she says, "Ulle ulla மெழுகு உருக்கி வெங்கலம் ஊற்ற வழி செய்வது போல்." So she's talking about how she's comparing these rain clouds to the wax mold and says she's beseeching them to rain down on her Ishtadevi, on her beloved deity, in the same way that the wax flows out of the mold and so on. So it's a kind of interesting metaphoric use again of these pyrotechnological processes. And of course, also seen a very lovely depiction in the Yakshagana puppetry, where now we don't see that so much really, but in Karnataka it used to be very popular, these puppetry performances. And there's a very, beautiful episode of Ravana in Lanka, and then Hanuman with his tail goes around burning down Lanka. And so you have this puppeteer at the back and Hanuman sort of moving all around with his tail and so on. It's very graphic and it's at a climatic point as well. So, but I remember now seeing that years ago, and I'm sorry to say many of these kinds of folk art forms are just getting increasingly marginalized and not being seen that much. So that is another concern. We've also done this contemporary classical dance production, which is called Danse Étoile. Again, it was a little bit, of course, inspired by this aspect of the five elements and, the Nataraja dance and all that. But going beyond that, also probably trying to convey the sort of divide between the classical and the quantum realities, or the Cartesian divide between chaos and flux and then order, and the world of classical physics and quantum physics, which is more chaotic. But we also had this depiction, one of the five elements of fire. And because it was an internet streamed event, and this was a collaboration with this French dance company, Cadence, and this dancer, Anisha Emrit, who was dancing in Toulouse. And so it was interactive, and, she was like kind of tossing her hair around, and all of this was kind of flaming around like this. And then it was interactively streamed, whereas I was sort of a bit more diminutive, and you could see me sort of dancing through the hair. And so when I look back on it, yes, it does give a sense to me, as I was talking about these forest fires and then of course also we've seen this Oscar-winning film, which also talks about some of these baby elephants who got abandoned because of these kinds of phenomena, such as wildfires. So there again, that idea to talk about the reasons for concern for the environment, which if handled properly in its control, and if it's controlled, it's for the good of mankind. But otherwise, these destructive fires, it has the potential to also become something that goes out of our controls.
Thank you. Absolutely beautiful. In fact, I'm writing a blog right now on breath because it's connected, fire and respiration. So I am coming across a lot of these kind of aspects also within the field of respiration itself, and how crucial that is and how constrained it's becoming as time passes.
Absolutely, that's right. You're very true that the breathing and fire and pollution and all of that, breathing fresh air and all that, is also something that's very intrinsically interlinked. And it's, I think, a very fascinating way of approaching these ideas, because sometimes the thing that links phenomena are not very obvious to us. And talking about the breath, it's also very interesting, since I was talking about the South American cultures. One of the reasons why they didn't actually perhaps use bellows is because they believed so much in the symbolism of human breath that they didn't think that we should actually have bellows, because everything is, they held human breath to be so sacred. So that was one reason why they didn't. But if you think about it metaphorically, it actually meant that it didn't result in other kinds of technologies which would have been more polluting. So in a way, that did maintain the sanctity of breath. So it's very interesting that your point actually brought that notion as well to me.
Thank you so much. And if you would like to give us any parting thoughts or talk about your present research interests, because from what I've seen, you always are working on something interesting. So I'd be curious to know what is interesting you presently.
Oh, well, there are actually a lot of things. So I can't quite pinpoint anyone. But yeah, well, now we're also involved with the analysis, got our own X-ray fluorescence machine. So we've been doing much more of the analysis of some of these materials I've been talking about. And also maybe moving on, been looking a lot of metals, but also maybe glass beads and various other kinds of things. So I suppose more boring archaeomaterials. But anyway, for us, it's very exciting to know how things were made. When I publishing more on it, then we could talk. But yes, a lot of it is also on the materials coming out of excavations in Tamil Nadu, which are quite exciting now, and they seem to be pushing the dates backwards, earlier dates, let's say places like Kiridi and so on, going back to 6th century, and Arichambur also, which had some early days, looking at the remnants of the early, this Iron Age historic transition, which is quite enigmatic.
Thank you. And I have to say, listening to you, nobody could ever think these subjects are boring. So we really appreciate you joining us. It's been such an honor and a pleasure. And I do hope to be in touch, because it's so wonderful to speak to somebody like you who really works at this intersection of art and science and expresses this so beautifully. So thank you.
Thank you. And all the best. Thank you so much.
Thanks to Professor Sharda Srinivasan for sharing her thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.